Welcome back, AP. All right, welcome back to this really cold Saturday morning, but at least the sun's out and the wind's not blowing, and also at least I'm starting to feel a lot better. So the big thing about it though is we went over so much important stuff during those virtual lessons, right? We talked about the flying shuttle, the spinning jetty, the water frame, the spinning mule, we could have talked about porcelain if we wanted to, but I don't really feel like talking about Bödinger and also the fact that European porcelains are pretty irrelevant. Now, the thing about it though, looking at all of this stuff, we've been talking about this industrial revolution in very, very grandiose terms. Now, going forward, okay, there's going to be a lot of mixing and matching and crazy things going on because the 19th century Europe is very, very intense. You've got the blowing up of industry. You've got the recouping after Napoleon. You're going to have these major revolutions that take place in 1848. Lots of liberal reform, the battling of political ideologies, all this other crazy stuff, and your brain is probably going to feel a little bit like this.
What's his name? What's his name? I got nothing on a name. Come on, baby, what's the name? We threw out his name!
But to avoid that, right, the big reason why I'm making sure that we can actually understand it, I took a little bit longer to post this flip because I reworked the entire thing. I have gone through and reworked everything from here to the end of this unit in a manner that makes it make way more sense, all right? So because going forward, I need this to read like a narrative. I need this to be like a narrative, and a lot of times the College Board and the people who write these textbooks don't care about that, right? This has to be a narrative, okay? And where we left off in our narrative last was we've got the booming industrial revolution going on in Great Britain. We've got textile production going out the yin-yang, and now we're moving into the production of iron and steel, right? So now, well, not steel yet. The Bessemer process doesn't get invented in Germany until a little bit later, but iron production is getting really big. And we looked at these little guys right when we left off in class, right? These little ingots, right? So these are iron ingots, also known as piglets. That's why they're called pig iron, all right? But literally a lot of this has to do with the smelting process, right? And early on in the smelting process, you used wood, right? You used wood power to heat an oven or a forge up to be as hot as possible so you can melt the iron out of rock, right? So that is what smelting actually is you're heating up a piece of sediment and allowing the iron to bleed out of it, and then you collect the iron at the bottom and you chop it up into these little piggies, and then you got piglets or iron ingots, right? So pig iron. So when you have that now, you can now melt that into other items, and you can cast it into molds, and you can make it into things, right? Now, going forward, though, wood power is starting to run really low. As McKenna Euro perfectly said, America said nope, and then literally just decided to leave, and so they were running out of their major lumber sources over in the Americas. So what are they going to turn to? They're going to turn to coal power. Now, they could have been like the Dutch and turned to wind power and saved everybody a lot of pollution, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on, right? Now, coal power, though, is going to be a massive thing that takes over all of, Europe. Literally, I was talking to you about those pepper moths. You were coal power literally has far-reaching consequences. So, look at these guys. Look at these pepper moths real quick. So, pepper moths have literally evolved over time to have these really weird color distributions. This is what they're supposed to look like naturally. This is what a lot of them look like now, because during the Industrial Revolution, the coal soot pollution got so bad that coal was caking the trees, so the darker pepper moths survived, and literally we were messing with Darwin's whole idea. It's pretty messed up when you think about it, right? So now going into it, though, we understand that coal is starting to boom, right? We get that coal is starting to take over, that there's an energy, whoa. We understand that coal power is really starting to take over and really starting to push everything forward, right? Now, wait a minute, though, pump the brakes. Where do you get this coal from? Where is it coming from? Well, another big reason why the revolution started in Britain, or the Industrial Revolution started in Britain, is because of their access to large coal deposits. Those coal deposits were stored underground, right? So the thing about it, though, is they were having a huge problem with these mining operations, right? Some of the earliest coal mines had a huge problem with flooding, right? So, and some of these earliest coal mines also had, weren't even just coal mines. There were mines for lead and other items like that as well for the Industrial Revolution. But these mines would fill with water regularly, right? And earliest on, whenever the coal power needed to be actually boosted up as possible and get as much coal out of there as possible, the earliest versions of the of getting that water out of those coal mines was using animal power, right? You would actually literally take a horse and you would tie him to a stick, and that stick would be around another stick, and the horse would walk around in a circle, pulling pulling a lever that would put a rope down into the mine with buckets, and it would bail the water out progressively, right? And that is going to be a very, very important thing coming forward. But Savory and Newcomen are two guys that come along that try to figure out a way to replace that horse, right? And they come up with the very first steam engine, right? So their steam engine, though, is very simple. Very rudimentary, very, very basic. All it requires is like a hot burner, and it actually creates the steam, pushing this valve up, depressing this valve, and then it has a release, and then the suction then pulls it back forward. Very, very simple, not a lot to it, right? Very, very easy steam engine. You could basically make this thing at your house. But their names are Thomas Savory and John Newcomen, right? So they create this thing to try and make it so it's easier to get that water out of those mines, right? And it works pretty well for a while until this guy comes along. James Watt, who is a Scottish thinker who realizes that, wait a minute, these things break all the time. So Savory and Newcomen's biggest problem with their steam engines is they would regularly break, right? They break all the time, mainly due to the fact that their steam engines vented the steam off constantly, right? And since it's venting that steam off all the time, that means that you have to keep constantly filling it with water. So if you don't have water on hand to actually fill it with, and the water needs to be decently clean or else the impurities are going to clog the mechanism, so you have to actually keep filling it with decently clean water, and if you end up running out of it, it's going to literally dry rot, and then it's not going to work, and then because you got nothing to make steam out of, right? So James Watt, the Scottish thinker and tinkerer, was called in to fix one of these steam engines, right? And he realized something. Wait a minute, what if we added a condenser onto it, right? So over here on the side, he added this specific part, a condenser. And the condenser takes some of that excess steam, condenses it onto the sides of the glass, and then the water beads off onto the bottom, and it recycles the steam in and of itself, creating a much more efficient steam engine. And then also James Watt realized, I can make these much smaller, right? And he made them much smaller, and now, wait a minute, this is the biggest thing about James Watt's steam engine. Go ahead and write this down. It can be attached to other things. It's not stationary like Thomas Savory and John Newcomen's is. This thing right here was huge and could not be moved, whereas James Watt's was small and you could slap it onto things, right? That's where the power loom came from, right? When we looked at flying shuttle, spinning jenny, water frame, Samuel Morse's spinning mule, right? Then you take Watt's steam engine, you slap that onto one of these looms. Now that loom is fully automated. It's now steam powered, right? So that's a big thing. You take this thing and you slap it onto a locomotive. It's a now steam powered locomotive, right? You take this thing, you put it onto a boat, steam powered boat, like the Natchez, right? For example, is a steam powered vessel. That's why it's got all those big coal smokestacks on the top of it. James Watt's thing is so important. We even see something he used to describe the power output in it in modern day society. You ever heard the phrase horsepower? It's because it's talking about the original use of those mining baling systems of those horses moving around that pivot. That's where that horsepower comes from. And James Watt was like, oh, well, my steam engine can produce X amount of horsepower, right? And also he was so famous that we use his steam engine, but we now use coal-burning power plants, and we use his steam engine to create power and electricity in the modern era. That's why we refer to what comes out of our sockets as watts, right? So look at that. Look at that. Look at it all coming full circle, right? Now we got to talk about some people's favorite things, railroads. Because apparently y'all are obsessed with this thing. Yeah, this is a song that for some reason every single year kids sing in my class whenever we talk about railroads. I don't know why, but apparently y'all are really into it, right? But the big thing about it is let's talk about railroads in general. Now, railroads are kind of like this weird little thing that we flirt with talking about how it's slightly a part of that second industrial revolution or the tail end of the first one, but railroads are super important, and my wife is telling me I need to stop yelling. But they have to hear me though, sweetheart.
They have volume controls on their computer.
But what if they don't know that I'm excited?
They don't need to know.
But I'm excited about railroads.
Oh my god.
So, all right, anyway, now, so check this out. The biggest thing about it, though, is the roads were already there. All right, so roads came before railroads, so you do need to understand the fact that the infrastructure that has actually been making itself available since the 1800s is available, right? Because remember, we talked about absolutism and 17th and 18th century monarchs needed to increase their infrastructure and stuff like that to make like ruling over a larger domain possible. Well, building those roads is a part of that infrastructure. So the road availability was amazing, and they also, like, all you had to do now was just slap some rails on top of it. And the railroads were already there before the locomotive. So whenever you look at all these ideas about what came first, the chicken or the egg, or what came first, the railroad or the locomotive, the railroad came first, right? Because rails were just added to pre-existing roads, and they were used to move heavy carts back and forth, because when coal would come out of the mine, you would slap it into one of those carts, and the rails made it so you could push heavy carts of like coal great distances, right? And the earliest forms of railroads, they had horses pulling carts, right? Horses pulling carts down these railroads before the locomotive ever even existed. Now, the original locomotive was actually an idea to not even exist on like rails. This is the very first steam-powered locomotive. It was invented by this guy named like Narcourt or Nowcourt or whatever, but it was originally created in the late 1700s, and as you can see, the very first time they tried to test it, they ran it straight into a wall, because it was almost impossible to drive, and it was very, very big and weird, and it also is considered to be one of the very first tractors, right? So, like, now the thing about this original automotive, though, is it just demonstrated the fact that people weren't ready to drive large vehicles over open spaces with no guidance. So how do you make it easier? Take this bad boy and slap it onto those rails that are already there. So George Stephenson comes along and he invents this thing called the rocket, right? And the rocket gets invented in 1830, and it's the very first steam-powered locomotive, right? And he was like, oh, we can use these rails that already exist as guidance systems, so we don't have to worry about people running this thing into a wall anymore, right? Way to go, guys. Very, very impressive. Now, George Stephenson's The Rocket is the very first locomotive, and as you can see, looking at it right here, it was smaller, very simple. You shoveled coal into it, and it was mainly used to move items over shorter distances, right? Which worked out perfectly for Great Britain again, because they're an island, right? They're a smaller island where these cities are actually located near port cities and things like that, which is another giant reason why like Britain is going to be the home of the entire like Industrial Revolution, is because of the port system and island economic system that they have, right? So now you're going to start seeing, because of this device, write this down, you're going to start seeing cities pop up near central factory locations, central mining locations, and central port locations. You're going to see cities pop up like Manchester, Birmingham, and other areas that are centrally located through the industrial paradigm, right? So like now, the locomotive, though, is making it easy to move those items throughout those cities. Thank you, George Stephenson, for the rocket. We really, really appreciate it. And it becomes such a big thing during the Industrial Revolution, the idea of the locomotive and the shock and awe of this thing that can move things such great spaces, is that basically railroads are going to be put up everywhere rapidly all over the island, and also you're going to see the growth of businesses that are going to come out of this as well, because the continued downfall of the cottage industry and the putting out system is just being made more obsolete by railroads, right? This is further going to push forward the idea, though, also of the urban working class, right? So because think about it this way, as these railroads get put up rapidly all over the island to connect now these major cities, if you're looking for a job now that the cottage industry is dying because factories are replacing your work, where are you going to go? You're going to go to these major cities that are popping up along the railroad networks. Networks, for example, like Birmingham, and for example, like, oh, and I know for a fact a couple of y'all are going to get so excited when we talk about Victorian-era England, which is the second Industrial Revolution England. We're talking about, like, the Sherlock Holmes era, right? So the big soot factories and the and all that stuff. Now, the thing about it, though, is all you see in Victoria-era England, like, ideas, stop, get off the doorknob. You're about to break out. Quit it. All right, so sorry, this little boy is an escape artist, all right? Like, he saw his mom go outside, and he was literally just pawing at the doorknob, right? So, but you're going to see the growth of these cities, and you're going to see the growth of this urban working class that works in a lot of them, the poorer urban working class anyway, going forward. And then, like I was saying a second ago, before I literally forgot that there were, like, a couple extra words on here, is you're going to see the shock and awe of these things even play out in the in the romantic art movement that's going on at the time, okay? Romantic artists are going to start painting beautiful pictures of locomotives and steam-powered devices and all these things going forward, demonstrating just the great lengths that technology has come. This one, for example, is by a very famous artist, Claude Monet, right? So like this is by Monet. Now this, of course, though, is way into the second industrial revolution because you see how advanced these trains are by comparison to Stephenson's rocket. But the big thing about it, though, is like you're seeing a lot of famous guys come along. One of my favorite artists ever, Joseph M.W. Turner, does a very famous piece using that the Fighting Tambourine, the one that's on the background of my smartboard, right? So like as you can see, the Industrial Revolution is permeating into all facets of society, and it probably is because due to the fact that Britain is like the workshop of the world at this point, right? And people in the continent are aware that these things are happening. People in the continent are aware that these things are going on. He almost broke out. He literally was up there hitting the lever to try and get out. So anyway. But the big thing, though, is that, yes, Britain is the workshop of the world, right? Everybody knows that something's going on there, but still the people in the continent aren't quite sure what is happening, right? Now, of course, this is during the first Industrial Revolution. Now, looking at the entire understanding of this, because due to the fact, why would they be called this? Well, mainly because they produce 2/3 of the world's coal by this point and half of its iron and cotton, right? So everyone is starting to realize that by the mid-1800s that Britain is the industrial powerhouse, right? They're producing so many necessary commodities that it's just mind-boggling the rest of the world, right? There's only one country that is going to threaten their industrialism, and that's Germany in the early 1900s. Germany is going to have a massive industrial boom in the early 1900s, and it's going to be a really big reason why we lead into World War I, right? So like now, but the other big thing about it, there's another ridiculous statistic that demonstrates Britain's industrial output, because in 1750, before the Industrial Revolution began, historians predict that the British were responsible for producing about 2% of the world's industrial output. By 1860, they were responsible for 20% of it, right? So as you can see, Britain is leaving the continent far behind, right? They're like, okay, y'all can mess around with Napoleon and you can clean up and fix all that stuff. We're going to basically build and create everything, right? You're going to see literally the GNP. The GNP stands for Gross National Product of Britain is going to quadruple itself over the first Industrial Revolution. But here's the other kicker too. Very important. Star this statistic right here. Super big deal. Their population exploded, right? The Industrial Revolution also goes hand in hand with population growth, right? You're going to see the population of Britain go from 9 million in the early 1700s to 21 million within 70 years, right? So like you're talking about by the 1800s, they have 21 million. And remember, during the French Revolution, it was always considered that they were the most populated country by a long shot with 25 million, but Britain is gaining on them fast because of the Industrial Revolution. Now, you're also seeing a new development of science. You're seeing the growth of economics, right? Because of the Industrial Revolution and because of the great leaping forward of capitalism, capital systems, and free market societies, you're seeing the growth of these things called economic scientists and economic theory. By the way, just so you know, economics is known as the dismal science because it's like no matter how you slice it, no matter how you cut it, when it comes to economics, someone's getting stepped on, right? So like looking at this, you can see a lot of early economists come out during the Industrial Revolution, the first economists, and they literally have different schools of thought in economics named after them, come along with very dismal outlooks on the progression of society after the Industrial Revolution. It's kind of one of those weird things where the Industrial Revolution is responsible for making the sweater that I'm wearing right now that's super comfortable and I love it, but it's also responsible for population crises, right? So Thomas Malthus, also known as a Malthusian economist because he created the school of thought known as Malthusian economics, has an essay on the principle of population where he believed because of industrialization, we were going to start having population growth that was so drastic that we would outpace our resources and starve ourselves to death, right? Well, he was wrong. However, he was correct in one facet of it. We are using our resources at an unexponentially acceptable rate, right? So eventually we will run out of certain goods and figure out ways to replace them, right? So he is correct, though, on the population growing and the use of resources, right? It's just not as gloom and doom as he thought. But then you've got another guy named David Ricardo who popularizes this concept called the iron law of wages, right? Now, this one is the depressing law. The iron law of wages states that literally most of the working populace, or working populace in general, will always gravitate towards minimum wage, right? Due to the fact that, like, basically there's an excessive amount of workers. And now because of population growth and that there's a lot of workers, that labor for other jobs is not valued the same as it is in other areas, right? And so manual labor will gravitate towards a lower wage while other labors will not. And we'll talk more about the iron law of wages a little bit later, but David Ricardo and his ideas directly contrast somebody else that we're about to bring up in about. And I know one of y'all know who that guy is that we're about to bring up in about 2 seconds. He's got a long beard, and he really, really loves the means of production being owned by the people. But we'll talk about him in a second. So you're going to see, like I said, with the earlier stuff, growing population, growing GNP, growing industrial outputs, growing factory classes, growing factory work, railroads, creating infrastructure and transportation, making all that stuff easier. You're going to see massive societal impacts of the Industrial Revolution as well, though, okay? So you're going to see basically the biggest one, though, is the changing of social classes. So you're going to see the social class paradigm change up quite a bit, okay? So you're going to end up having an upper class at the very, very top, which is your old money and what's left of the old nobility, right? So because remember, the Industrial Revolution didn't just do away with lords and nobles. They're still there, and they still own an excessive amount of land, excessive amount of resources, and an excessive amount of money. They're just going to twist and change how they make their money over time and go forward in a different direction, because that's a big thing. People at the top typically tend to try and stay at the top, right? So the upper class, which is the old money, the what's left of that old nobility, a lot of them are going to become invested in banking, and they're going to find their new futures in the Industrial Revolution and find ways to make money off of the money that they already have, right? Which is so depressing to say. Now, anyway, going forward, though, also we're going to see the growth of the industrial middle class, right? Which, as you can see, I've got a big brick right here. The industrial middle class is growing rapidly. So rapidly, about by the end of the 1800s, you have your upper middle class, your middle class, and your lower middle class, right? So your lower middle class kind of flirts with being lower class, and they kind of like begin to organize them and things like that, which is going to be very important later on when it comes to unions and striking and trying to get more workers' rights. So in the industrial middle class, you're going to see huge growth, okay? Factory owners, professionals, the educated. We have formally always referred to these people as the bourgeois, right? So like the bourgeois is now becoming the industrial middle class, and where that word comes from, bourgeois, literally means city dweller, right? Or person who lives in the city and has some money, right? Because B-O-U-R-G literally means it's like dweller of a city or in a fake part of town, right? A Burg or a Bürger for German like speakers out there means a person who lives in a city, okay? They're professionals, they're highly educated, and they also can be split into multiple layers like we talked about a little bit later on. Now, industrial working class, though, is going to be probably the biggest focal point of the Industrial Revolution because they are going to be where the seeds of communism grows. They're going to be where the seeds of revolutions grow, right? When we're talking about particularly the 1917 revolution in Russia, and when we're talking about the Paris Commune that does occur in 1871 in France, right? So, like, we'll talk about those things a little bit later on, but those are your factory workers, your laborers, right? Your hard workers that bust themselves to death just trying to make, like, ends meet, right? They also can be split into multiple layers, and we'll talk about those guys a little bit later on as well. Now, scary part of this, though, is that with the Industrial Revolution, with the proliferation of reading material, with the proliferation of education, you're also seeing people start to become aware of where they are in this. So during the Middle Ages, early modern period, 1600s to 1700s, people were just kind of believed their location in society was where it was, and they didn't really have any understanding of the society, like societal classes that existed outside of them, except for the one that was greatly far away from them, right? Your serf only knew of your noble that existed way above them, right? The only people that knew that the bourgeois existed were urban workers that lived in the city, which until the agricultural revolution, there wasn't that many of, right? So like with this entire thing, though, the Industrial Revolution is going to bring along this concept of class consciousness, right? Now, this societal impact will basically be copied and pasted throughout the continent as industrialism moves in that wave throughout the continent, right? Class consciousness means that individuals are now becoming aware of class differentiation. They're becoming aware of where they are located in society and the fact that that person above me works less than I do, but they make more money than I do. So this is the intense part. This term, class consciousness, doesn't even get coined until the 1840s by this guy. Yes, the most unfortunate Santa Claus ever, Karl Marx, right? So Karl Marx is the guy that actually coined that, and soon enough, we're going to be reading the manifesto, so I'll be going ahead and printing those out for you as well. Now, the big thing about it, though, is Friedrich Engels, who is Marx's partner, wrote diatribes about the conditions of the working class. They eventually write a book called Das Kapital. They actually write the Communist Manifesto. They started discussing, like, why is it that the people who are making the products are not the ones seeing the dividends of their labor, which is a big thing. So you're seeing the seeds of communism planted during the Industrial Revolution. They are going to grow, though, throughout the 1800s, and they are going to basically blossom in the 1900s, right? So now, going forward, though, you also are going to see a big differentiation in who works where does everyone work, and all this other stuff. And the last people we're going to leave off on is this industrial middle class, right? We're going to spend most of class talking about our industrial working class and where they work and things like that, but the industrial middle class is very important, okay? Because those are your factory owners and your entrepreneurs. Are we skipping over the upper class? Yes, because we know who they are, right? The industrial middle class, though, is how the bourgeois are changing their image, and they're actually moving towards being these factory owners and entrepreneurs and the participants in these free market capital societies. So looking forward, looking at the beginning, early factory owners struggled, okay? Very much so struggled. The earliest factory workers were at a high risk of failing business, right? The earliest factory owners and the earliest middle class workers and the earliest middle class business owners throughout Great Britain, and then also later in the continent as well. This is actually similar, or like true to them as well. But those factory workers, businesses had a 50% failure rate, right? So a lot of these middle class workers could go from the middle to the lower like that if they didn't make good calls. And one of the biggest things that they wanted to do was send their children to school, okay? So your earliest first generation middle class factory owners desperately wanted to get their children an education, right? Because it was highly valued in the middle class, and they struggled to keep their businesses afloat. But what ends up going down, though, is as they begin to make little bits of money, they start reinvesting into their businesses. They buy new machinery. Every single time the steam engine would have a new advent or a new machine would come along, they would try to expand their factories or add maybe one more spinning mule to their factory or one more spinning jenny to their ownership, right? They would literally try all the time to reinvest their profits to help actually provide more to make their children a better chance of going to school and actually getting an education. So what ends up happening, though, is their sons, notice I say sons because this is going to actually make gender distribution and gender roles in society so much worse than they were before. My wife could talk to you for days about how the Industrial Revolution dramatically affected the roles of women in society. And so I'm sure she would love to do that one day. Now, the big thing about it, though, is their sons, however, are going to begin to grow that gap between owner and worker, because those children that these early factory workers struggled to keep in school are now graduating. They are now entering in to the industrial middle class with knowledge in their mind about Thomas Malthus, about David Ricardo, and about economic science. And as they begin to change these factories, their profits begin to grow. And so you're seeing the gap between the worker and the factory owner, the poor and the middle class, grow exponentially. And you're also seeing the industrial middle class have its new layers, right? You're going to see some of these sons become the upper middle class, the middle class, and so maybe some of the ones that failed in their business, the lower middle class, right? So women's active role, though, as well, amongst the new industrial middle takes a massive hit because women are encouraged to not work. They are encouraged to be at home. They are encouraged to be people like governesses that actually tend to servants and things like that, or just be in charge of raising children. So it is going to drastically affect the roles of the industrial middle class woman, and we are still feeling massive effects of these growing separate spheres today, but we'll define those things a little bit better in class on the next time I see you, okay? So I hope y'all enjoyed it. I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.